Thank you. Now I will introduce our first speaker for today, IRENE AKINGBADE. IRENE is a member of the National Mobilization for Reproductive Justice in San Francisco. She joined the coalition and helped organize their first rally last October. A Chicago native, IRENE has lived in the Bay Area for 10 years and wanted to do something to join in the fight for reproductive rights locally. She looks forward to hearing everyone's ideas on how to reinvigorate the fight to control our own bodies.
Thank you so much, Louise. Hi, everyone. My name is Irene, and I'm a part of the San Francisco Organizing Committee for the National Mobilization for Reproductive Justice. While I'm not new to attending rallies and protests, I am very new to organizing and speaking. In mid-September of last year, my friend KRISTINA LEE, who you'll hear from shortly, called me and asked me if I'd like to do something to protect reproductive rights. And this was after the near total ban on abortion that was passed in Texas. It was that brief moment in time where the media reported on the horrifying facts and the seriousness of the draconian laws that were being passed. So that was that the bill made it illegal for people to get an abortion after 6 weeks of gestation, which is just 6 weeks from the first day of your last period. That a lot of people who can get pregnant, 6 weeks from the beginning of your last period isn't enough time to even have one missed period, much less realize that you might be pregnant. That it purposely and incorrectly defined a fetal heartbeat to be that as happening at 6 weeks, even though at 6 weeks, it's just electrical impulses from a fetal cell and not an actual heartbeat. And honestly, most horrifying, the bill not only allowed for vigilante monitoring of people exercising their reproductive choices, but rewarded them and encouraged them with the promise of a bounty to catch them if they got an abortion. So that was the context last year when KRISTINA asked me if I wanted to help. And that's why I immediately said yes. It all sounded very familiar to me as a Black woman to have a series of laws that sought to control the bodies of people, primarily women, and encourage vigilantism. It sounded way too familiar. And since then, sadly, more laws like that have been passed. So it's probably obvious why it's important for everyone to speak up. I think everyone here is here for that reason. And it may even be obvious why, as a woman, I felt the need to speak up. But why was it important for me as a Black person specifically to join the fight? Why is it important for Black people in general to lend their voices to the fight for reproductive justice? And why is it important for non-Black activists to center the voices of Black people? It's because it's all connected to the history of Black people specifically in this country. When speaking about reproductive rights, I think it's common to mention the hypocrisy of conservatives who say they care about life, but do nothing to save the lives of people giving birth, or do nothing to help or save the lives of parents and children once they are born. I know I've talked about it in the past, and I will continue to do so, because it is important to point out how they fight actively against education and contraception, which is curious, obviously, for people who supposedly are anti-abortion to be fighting so strongly for the few things that are proven to stop abortions. It's curious that they say that they care about lives, but they fight against universal health care or childcare, despite the millions of lives that would be saved by those measures. They actively gut any and every social safety net that would prevent giving birth as someone who is not wealthy to become a prison sentence where it locks someone away from any sort of choices in careers, any education, and personal development. And they actively fight against procedures that prevent the mental and physical harm of giving birth when one doesn't want to, or when one is pregnant in circumstances such as rape or in abuse. So those things get mentioned a lot, and they should. We should continue to bring them up. But what I think gets left out more often in mainstream conversations, at least, it's how it's all connected to the ongoing history of this country attacking the bodily autonomy of women, Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, trans and non-binary people, people who are physically or mentally disabled, undocumented immigrants, and other marginalized groups. Specifically this Black History Month, I think it's important to highlight how these attacks on reproductive rights affect the Black community. Unsurprisingly, these laws disproportionately affect Black lives. Forcing a Black person to give birth in the US can be a death sentence. The maternal mortality rate for Black people is 3.5 times higher than it is for white people. Even in California, this very wealthy and liberal state that I reside in, Black women are still more than 3 times likely to die of pregnancy-related causes than white women. And what might be surprising for someone who's hearing these statistics for the first time is that this disparity exists even despite education, which, as we all know, to a certain extent can be a signifier as class. So Black women who are college educated or higher, meaning they have their BA, their masters, their JDs, their PhDs, their MDs, are still 1.6 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related death than a white woman who has not completed high school. A history of medical racism means that giving birth in America while Black is something that a Black person must choose to do, and either has or is given the resources to do so. And honestly, let's talk about Black families who do not have the resources. Black families are disproportionately targeted by our racist carceral system. We all know stories of Black families who have been separated because the mother left the children alone for a few hours to go to a job interview, or because their place isn't up to code, despite the fact that is the fault of the building owners and landlords rather than the Black families who reside in those buildings. I think specifically of the case of Marissa Alexander, a Black woman in Florida who was imprisoned and sentenced to 20 years for shooting a gun as a warning to protect herself from her abusive husband. This happened in Florida, the state that has the notorious stand your ground laws that protected a murderer from the stalking and shooting death of Trayvon Martin. So despite the fact that this was a clear case of self-defense, she was sentenced for 20 years. Her life did not matter to the system. Her children's lives did not matter to the system. And if it wasn't for activists, she would still be in jail today. And this is also not even mentioning the fact that the over-policing of Black families works hand in hand with the lack of access to contraception, abortion, childcare, and healthcare. Without these resources, women like Marissa would not be able to leave their abusive relationships. These reproductive rights save lives. Another part of this is the history of forced sterilization in the Black community. Along with Indigenous and disabled women of all races, Black women were targeted by US eugenics. More than 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the 20th century, and a movement so inhumane that Nazi Germany literally took notes and based some of their abhorrent and atrocious laws on the US version of eugenics. And a famous example is in 1961, when Fannie Lou Hamer went to get what she thought was a fibroid removed from her uterus. And it ended up being that the hospital removed her entire uterus without her knowledge or consent. This was something that happened at that time so commonly to Black women that it was called a Mississippi appendectomy. And sadly, while that happened in 1961, it's not just a case of something that happened in recent history. It's something that is ongoing and happening right now. In California, again, where I reside, almost 150 women in the prison system were forcibly sterilized between 2006 and 2010. In ICE facilities, Black and brown immigrants were sterilized without their knowledge or consent. It was so bad that in an ICE facility in Georgia, a whistleblower had to tell about a doctor that was commonly called the uterus collector. In that facility, Pauline Binham, a 29-year-old Cameroonian woman, thought that she was going to get some cysts removed from her uterus. Instead, they gave her a complete hysterectomy, again, without her consent and without her knowledge. What happened to Fannie Lou Hamer in 1961 happened to this woman almost 60 years later. And you may have noticed that a lot of the data and examples I'm citing do not parse how or if trans and non-binary people were accounted for. But make no mistake, these laws affect Black, trans, and non-binary lives. Non-cis Black people already are disproportionately experiencing body policing and medical discrimination, even compared to their cis counterparts. So trans and non-binary people have been denied life-saving procedures because they are trans and non-binary. Without the reproductive rights we are fighting for right now, these injustices will not only continue, but they'll accelerate. Gender will continue to be policed and constrained to a binary that's tied to reproduction ability. Whether someone can give birth or not will define them, causing things like misgendering, medical discrimination, and assaults on trans and non-binary people, and even non-normative cis people. So for centuries, Black people have been denied the right of body autonomy. We've had to fight for the basic right to choose if and when to have children, the right to obtain and keep the basic necessities to take care of those children, the right to keep our families together and safe, and the right to define our bodies how we would like to define them. Therefore, it is unsurprising that with so much at stake and for so long, that Black people, specifically Black women, both cis and trans, and Black trans men across the diaspora have been at the forefront of the fight for reproductive justice since the days of enslavement. And that's why it's important that we're here today to talk about reproductive rights from a Black perspective. I do want to make something clear to those who are listening who are non-Black. Blackness is not a monolith. No one person, not including myself, speaks for all Black people across all genders, neighborhoods, countries, nationalities, classes, etc. Black people are not a monolith, and therefore insights from Black perspectives can be lost when not reaching out to different Black people. It's important for non-Black people to include all Black people into these discussions and movements. It's also important for non-Black people to show up for Black people in all areas, not just during reproductive rights rallies and movements. To even touch the surface of how these attacks on reproductive rights are related to white supremacy would take, quite frankly, far, far more time than we're allotted today. So in fighting for these rights, we also must fight for Black lives. I think about the pretty famous signs that were held in the 2017 Women's March, where, one sign I know for sure said something to the tune of, "I see you nice white ladies are here. You guys are going to show up for Black Lives Matter marches, right?" And I think about that sign a lot because it points to how sometimes in these activist spaces, Black people can be shut out in terms of other needs, even though they're related. So it's not just showing up for Black rallies and marches, it's showing up for and in Black neighborhoods. It's showing up and fighting for Black healthcare and Black resources. It's actively creating spaces for Black people who don't run in your circles or aren't a part of your lives or who you would not directly interact with normally. To the Black listeners who are joining us today, I want to reiterate about it all being connected. And that is why your voice is very important. Your participation is critical. We especially need to hear from and center Black people who have been further marginalized by their gender, their sexuality, their disability, their class, etc. I know we're all exhausted. I am too. Just yesterday, I heard news that just took me out. And that was the sentencing of the cop who shot Dante Wright yesterday. The judge cried for the cop and severely reduced the minimal sentence for that cop because, and I quote, so I'm gonna have to, it was not as serious. Her conduct was not as serious as it is necessary for manslaughter. Dante Wright is dead and he's not coming back. And our judicial system says, that's not that serious. That was a gut punch to me, even though it was, let's be real here, pretty expected at this point. We as Black people have been fighting a multi-century long fight for our rights and for our lives. And it is exhausting, but we're not in that fight alone. We are standing on the work of many people, and we are standing with each other and our allies. We are the people. Together, the people will win. Since September, I've been a participant in 3 rallies: the October 3rd rally, the December 12th, and the counter rally to the conservative pro-abortion groups coming in. And I have heard a variety of different stories and tales from Black college students who just happened upon the rallies wanting to do something, to homeless individuals who are asking us what's going on and wanting to be a part of the fight. With their words, with their experiences, bringing what they have, even if what they have was just their presence, was invigorating to the movement. I think despite the fact those numbers may not have been as big as, say, the Women's March in 2017, these rallies allowed many voices to come together. And that was just the work of a few dedicated people making it happen in San Francisco. That work gave me a lot of hope that this fight isn't unwinnable and that we can come together and win. So we can draw strength from each other and support each other to make material change. I hope at the end of this, everybody will participate and bring your ideas of what we can do next to fight for reproductive rights. The fight is nowhere near over. Roe v. Wade can be overturned at any time. And every day there's another state passing some disgusting draconian law limiting women's rights and access to abortion, contraceptives, sex education, healthcare, and family care. The fight is at our doorstep. But again, together we can win. So please bring your ideas, please bring your experiences, please bring your presence to these discussions because it's badly needed. Remember, even though you're tired, just like I am, your life matters, your voice matters, and your rights matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. So now I'm gonna invite our next speaker, KRISTINA LEE. KRISTINA is a Black and Chinese reproductive rights activist. She is the Comrades of Color Caucus coordinator for the Bay Area branch of the Freedom Socialist Party and an at-large member of Radical Women. She is a proud member of SEIU 1021. KRISTINA is a lifelong feminist and a longtime crisis intervention counselor for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault.
Thank you so much, Luis, and thank you so much, Irene. That was an excellent encapsulation on why the struggle for reproductive rights is so vital for Black folks and queer and trans folks more specifically, and the necessity of a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-issue approach to win it. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about why the fight for reproductive justice is so close to my heart, why we're seeing the attacks on abortion that we're seeing at this time, and why this struggle is so important to Black women. And how we can build a movement that will protect and defend all of our rights. The fight for our reproductive rights has spanned generations, and I remember when the baton was handed to me. While attending Sacramento State, I would take Amtrak to visit folks at home in San Francisco. These trips enabled me to get into interesting discussions with other passengers, folks that I, might not have approached if we weren't trapped on a train together. On one of these trips, I was reading an article from the local paper about abortion, and I got into a lively discussion with an older white woman about the escalating attacks. Our discussion ended with the charge, if your generation wants to keep the right to abortion, you'll need to fight for it. This conversation has stuck with me over the years, and the significance of her words has grown. At the time, I naively believed that my dutiful donations to pro-choice nonprofits would be enough to stop the growing restrictions on access to abortion and birth control. However, as threats to reproductive rights have grown, the pro-choice nonprofits I used to donate to haven't organized any meaningful defense of the fundamental right to decide what to do with our bodies. Instead, they directed folks to vote for and funnel their dollars into the pockets of pro-choice Democrats, who also have put no meaningful effort into stopping the attacks. Relying on capitalist politicians to protect our reproductive rights have not prevented the hundreds of targeted restrictions on abortion provider or TRAP laws enacted to shut down abortion clinics and prevent access to abortions by imposing expensive and medically unnecessary requirements. The anti-abortion activists are still trying to give right-wing justices on the Supreme Court the opportunity to take away our right to abortion by passing laws that make the window of time where people are able to have one shorter, like the recent Texas law, which bans abortions after 6 weeks and puts a $10,000 bounty on anyone assisting someone to get one. These and other anti-abortion laws are based in deliberate misinformation about abortion and have stigmatized it to the point where many medical students aren't even learning how to talk to their patients about abortion, and even fewer are learning how to perform them, further limiting access. Our mainstream reproductive rights movement has not adequately defended our rights, and the singular focus on abortion doesn't represent the breadth of Black women's views of our reproductive concerns. In 1994, the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice created the concept of reproductive justice in order to ensure that the scope of our needs were represented, calling for the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Reproductive justice is a holistic approach that addresses the full spectrum of areas that are affected by these decisions. So, why is there an intensifying global war on abortion rights? The capitalist system doesn't want us to control our bodies. It all goes back to the profit system's need to make money off of the free labor that women and other child and elder care folks do in the home. This model serves as justification for why women and women of color get paid less than men. Black women have always done underpaid and unpaid work caring for our own and other families. Under slavery, we were forced to prioritize the care of our enslavers' families over our own, and any children we had became additional assets for our enslavers. Under capitalism, women are most cared for caring for workers and creating more. And capitalism does not tolerate the freedom to control our bodies, lives, and reproduction any more than they will ensure equal pay or fully funded health care, childcare. Anti-abortion is also the main recruiting tool of the far right. It serves as their cover for racism, misogyny, and anti-LGBTQ+ bigotry. Their own slogan says it best: make women property again. These pro-deathers are the shock troops for the ruling class, the same ilk who attempted the coup on January 6th. The capitalist profit system is in deep crisis and causing a whole lot of suffering. Working people, especially women of color and essential workers, are caring for others due to the COVID pandemic, while big business makes record profits. Keeping us struggling to survive, the CEOs fund attacks on reproductive rights. They also pay for lobbyists to get laws passed that deny voting rights, police reform, and union organizing. The hysteria around critical race theory and the recent Florida Don't Say Gay bill that bans discussion about sexual orientation and gender identities in schools are just a few more examples of the things that they like to pretend are important. These constant attacks on us mean that we cannot focus solely on retaining the right to abortion and birth control. The decision about whether someone chooses to be pregnant is never a decision made in a vacuum. Our life circumstances and identities affect not only the choices we have access to, but what we're able to imagine for liberatory futures. Black women have been fearless in advocating for the healthcare we need. It is well documented that medical professionals don't listen to women's concerns about their health. For Black women specifically, old stereotypes about Black people being able to feel less pain means that we are either not believed or not treated for our symptoms and injuries. Our maternal mortality rates are 3 to 4 times those of white and Latina women. And we remember the histories of our foremothers being sterilized against their will or subjected to eugenicist plots. We suffered the painful experiences of seeing our communities vilified for having children and needing support. So we fight to make sure that we have access to as many choices as possible, from doulas to abortion, because this is a literal battle between life and death. And we fight for all the other issues that impact us: affordable housing, living wages, massively defunding the police, stopping destructive climate change, voting rights, trans and queer folks' rights, quality education. These legacies and today's realities are why we've seen some of the most revolutionary demands come from Black folks. As a group whose members are attacked by capitalist structures just for being Black, in addition to being attacked for our other marginalized identities, Black women, queer and trans Black folks have always demanded that movements for liberation be more inclusive and address needs that would improve conditions for broader groups of people. This political perspective is essential today. So, how do we fight all this? We live in the belly of a massive capitalist beast that is full of resources. Our communities should not be pitted against one another for the resources we need to survive and thrive. We need to end capitalism, a system where private owners own the means of production and control our laws and lives, and replace it with socialism, a system where workers are in control of the means of production and of our destinies. We can be inspired by the worldwide fight that is being waged by reproductive justice in Argentina, Ireland, and Poland, as well as many others. The struggle for Black liberation is inexorably linked with the struggle to end capitalism. This is a principle of the Freedom Socialist Party and radical women's theory of revolutionary integration, which is based on our party founders' experiences and study during the civil rights movement, and explains that it will take an anti-capitalist revolution to truly end racism, segregation, and white supremacy, and that we're not gonna have that revolution without the leadership of militant Black workers, particularly Black women and LGBTQ folks. And, and we're not gonna have, and without this, we can't have an anti-capitalist revolution in the United States, which is essential for a global revolution without this leadership. Another way that we must strengthen the movement to defend abortion and expand reproductive rights is to push our unions into action. Women are a little over 57% of the American workforce, and abortion and access to reproductive health care is a labor issue. the fair union wages, retirement benefits, medical care, and overall stability that one benefits from in unionized work allow women to have more choices in terms of their reproduction, including the ability to be single longer, marry later, have access to education and better paying jobs. Women of color are set to dominate the workforce in the near future, and we must make sure that the unions are representing our needs. In 2012, the delegates to the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees voted to affirm the need for reproductive rights. AFSCME also wrote an amicus brief in support of abortion for the upcoming Supreme Court case. In 2019, the Washington State Labor Council Convention passed a resolution affirming that reproductive rights are workers' rights. In our fights to protect our rights, we must make sure that our unions are fighting alongside us. Radical women and the Freedom Socialist Party have been part of the struggle to defend and expand reproductive rights since our founding, over 50 years ago. Our understanding that capitalism requires the exploitation of women and people of color means that we fearlessly organize whenever reproductive rights are at stake. In 1984, we were part of a community defense of the Everett Feminist Women's Health Center, where we exposed law enforcement and government complicity in the harassment the center was experiencing, forced the mayor to order 24-hour security checks, and exposed the well-connected terrorists carrying them out. In 2004, radical women answered the call to defend Mississippi's last abortion clinic with a militant and diverse contingent who built solidarity against the attempts to denigrate and divide them. This coalition was led by young Black grassroots organizers from the state who knew that solidarity meant defending everyone in the coalition from attacks, and that they couldn't depend on the national nonprofits who used the situation to raise money, half of which went to enrich the executives and half of which went to pay for security improvements and private guards. The nonprofits convinced the owner of the clinic to tell the communities not to come out. Nevertheless, our tenacious doorbelling, rallies, and phone calls ensured that our side outnumbered the right wing, Operation Rescue, and their attempts to harass the clinics. All of our branches have organized clinic defense and organized to keep the anti-abortionists away from our clinics. In response to the urgency of the latest attacks on our reproductive rights, radical women founded the National Mobilization for Reproductive Justice with other organizations and individuals. Our goal is to rebuild a multi-issue, multiracial, and inclusive movement. We demand that we protect and expand Roe v. Wade with safe and legal abortion on demand without apology, that the Hyde Amendment and other state barriers to reproductive rights be repealed and overturned, an end to forced sterilization, child welfare abuses, environmental and medical racism. We call for defense of queer and trans families and for universal health care, medically sound sex education, and affordable health care. We demand sexual self-determination for people with disabilities, and that we uphold social progress with expanded voting rights and strong unions. Our uncompromising and bold demands don't leave anyone behind, and our fight for what we need and not just what we can win are key to building the movement. The actions that our coalition have sparked across the country are the abortion activism that I and others that we work with have needed. We took to the streets and demanded our rights, challenging church and state attempts to decide our fates. We stood up to the March for Life protesters and right-wingers who invaded our cities. We showed not only them, but our cities and each other's, that we are the voices we needed at this moment. That by coming together to fight, we could throw off the weights of despair and demand not only to keep the rights we have, but to achieve more, to ensure that each and every one of us has what we need to control our futures. We stood shoulder to shoulder, from longtime veterans of the struggle to newcomers roused by our messages and eager to add their voices. The National Mobilization for Reproductive Justice is currently focusing on educating about the need to defend our reproductive rights and the right to abortion. outreach, and coalition building so that we can respond to reproductive rights or issues as they arise both nationally and locally. This is why we need unions, schools, community, the media, and you alongside us. Just as the woman I met on Amtrak so many years ago said, my generation does need to fight to keep our right to abortion. Luckily, we are not alone. This is a multi-generational, multi-issue, multi-gender, multiracial struggle. The demands we're fighting for will give all of us as women, as workers, as queer and trans people, as folks of color, as humans, the ability to make decisions about our lives without the coercion of capitalism, the church, or the state. And working with a national coalition of people to fight for them is what I need to be doing. We need to fight racism, sexism, transphobia, and their root cause, capitalism, and the system that they built. This is what we need and need now as the system strips away rights and autonomy away from those who are already the most vulnerable within this system. Black women are fighting for the full spectrum of reproductive rights beyond the establishment groups that are willing to give up what we have left. We are firing up a militancy in the movement for reproductive justice because we have nothing to lose and everything to win. And all of society benefits when the conditions of Black women are lifted. We need everyone who is impacted by the assaults, raining down from the powers that be, to be part of a fierce movement in the streets, because we are all affected if the right to abortion is taken. And being in the streets is the only way to achieve our demands and the world we have to gain. I don't have time to be demoralized. I'm fighting for our rights, and I want you all to fight alongside me.
Hi, yes, amazing speeches by both Irene and Christina, and I promise we will soon start the discussion. But before that, I want to, like I said, invite Sarah so that she can let us know how we can be more involved with Radical Women in the FSP.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm a Black woman sailor, a member of Radical Women, and of our Comrades of Color Caucus. Radical Women is a grassroots organization that does not receive corporate funding of any kind. So we rely exclusively on member and community contributions. So I want to kick off tonight's fundraising effort by telling you what your contributions will do to help us fight anti-Black racism